few weeks ago, I was given a copy of a chapel talk by a woman named Georgie Brinkley, who's a 2010 graduate of Groton. Georgie Brinkley addressed faith. This young woman addressed faith in a very interesting and meaningful way. She was very open about her process of developing faith and how her faith has changed as she has explored it. She talked about starting with a very kind of personal faith, private, closed. She articulated an antipathy for church or community. For her, faith lived in isolation and had nothing to do with a community whatsoever. And she described that process of living a life in isolation, a tower by herself. And she talked about how difficult it was at times to live this isolated vision of faith. But then she described as a senior moving into the process of confirmation, going through the series of classes where she explored the possibility of being confirmed. And she talked about the last class, sitting in this dark, Gothic chapel with her peers. And their instructor, in the last 5 minutes of the class, as per usual, I suppose, said, "Are there any questions?" And Georgie sat for a moment and raised her hand, and the floodgates opened. She realized that she had question after question that she wanted answered, and that her peers, her students, had questions they wanted answered. So it was a time of questions to the instructor and a time of questions with each other. And Georgie said when she went into that final class, she didn't know if she would be confirmed or not. But that it was in the process of asking questions and having questions answered, living in this kind of interchange of the moment, that she decided that she would be confirmed. Because in that class, that final class, that last 5 minutes of class, she recognized the role of church and community in her faith. That an isolated faith alone was not enough to sustain her. But what she desperately needed was relationship with fellow believers and seekers. And that the community for her provided strength when she didn't have strength of her own from her isolated tower. Georgie Brinkley articulated this as the power of questions. And I see that. But I think she's talking about something even more than that. I think she's talking about what the prayer for the baptismal candidates in that baptismal service calls an inquiring mind and a discerning heart. This idea that we're always in process of working this out, and the working out of it can only happen when we're together, seeking depth and knowledge and experience. And that so rarely happens when we live lives marked by isolation. This day, we celebrate the mystery of the triune God, Trinity Sunday. And as Episcopalians, we profess a faith, a belief in one God, manifest in three persons in unity of substance. We claim that the most complete way to understand God is as three persons, three separate persons, bound together in an eternal relationship. We arrive at this place because the early church experienced the power of God in these three manifest ways. The God of Israel, Father, Creator, that led Israel through the wilderness, brought them to the promised land. And in the church, the early Christian church experiences the person of Jesus, the incarnate Son. And then when Jesus ascends into heaven, the Spirit comes, and the early Christian community experiences God in a slightly different and new way. Now, we could talk forever about the process, the historical process of arriving at the Trinity as a doctrine. We could talk about the political dimensions of that process and the role of the institutional church coming to its full fruition. We could talk about the role of language and the misunderstandings and understandings about language as part of that process. We could talk about Greek philosophy as providing the context where all of this could happen together, and eventually the Trinity as a doctrine and an explanation could be born. But friends, ultimately, it seems to me that our understanding of the triune God is born out of a commitment to engage in faith, in the practice of it, and the development of it in community. We speak of Trinity because real men and women sought to understand something about God that they could agree upon, understand, and articulate together. Something that could be conceptualized and spoken. Real women and men wrestled together to say something meaningful, if utterly mystical, about the God that they knew. Friends, in this life, I don't know if we'll say anything more comprehensive about God than the Trinitarian formula. We certainly don't need to say anything more, any comprehensive. But what we do need is to remain engaged with one another, with the process, the ongoing process of the development of faith and the seeking of understanding. We need to cast aside the myth of individualism. We need to cast aside our individualistic tendencies and our closed minds and our lives of isolation that are based in fear and prejudice. We need to wrestle with the fact that we have been given, through God's grace, a picture of God that is about three beings living in a relationship together. We have a model of faith, unity, process, and love. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are found in faith through inquiring minds and discerning hearts. And that only happens when we live this together.